Stop plundering Africa's resources, the message from Pope Francis as he visits two of the continent's war-torn countries. What impact will his visit have on these states? And what future does Catholicism have in Africa? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. The Pope's visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo comes as it struggles to contain worsening violence. Eastern Congo has suffered unrest for years, but fighting has intensified and displaced 500,000 people since the resurgence of the M23 armed group. The pontiff will go to South Sudan, where civil war and conflict between rival ethnic groups is taking its toll on civilians. It highlights the instability of regional peace and how it's affecting citizens. The Pope's visits aim to highlight this, but does he have the answers? Malcolm Webb begins our coverage.
It's the first time since 1983 that a Pope has come to visit Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the country in Africa with the largest number of followers of the Roman Catholic Church. About half of Congo's nearly 100 million people are members. Pope Francis was due to visit in the middle of last year, but he had some problems with his knee, so the trip was postponed. The initial plan included a stop in eastern Congo, but escalating conflicts there resulted in that being dropped from the programme. Here in the capital Kinshasa, he's spoken about the forthcoming election, which is due to be held at the end of this year. He said it must be free, fair and credible. He also pointed a finger at the West for what he said was a poisonous greed for Congo's vast mineral wealth that he said was fueling Congo's conflicts. Malcolm Webb for Inside Story.
Now, the Catholic Church has significant influence in the DRC, where about half of the population identify as Roman Catholic. It's also critical of the country's politics. In 2016, the Church was at the centre of protests against the then-President Joseph Kabila. He was forced to renounce a third term. In 2018, it deployed observers to monitor the presidential election, saying it wanted to ensure credible results. Critics accuse the Church of meddling in Congolese politics. In 2020, Pope Francis met President Felix Tshisekedi to improve relations. And now the head of the Roman Catholic Church is in Kinshasa, ahead of elections this coming December. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by our guests. In Kinshasa is Christopher Lamb, who's usually based in Rome. He's the correspondent for the weekly Catholic newspaper, The Tablet. In Pennsylvania, USA, is Massimo Fagioli, a church historian and professor of theology and religious studies at Villanova University. And in Chicago is Stan Illo, a research professor of Catholic and African Studies at DePaul University. A very warm welcome to all of you on Inside Story, and thank you for your time. Christopher, can I just begin with you in Kinshasa? I mean, faith is an incredibly important part of life for those that believe in a higher spiritual guide. What does the Vatican hope then to achieve from the Pope's arrival in the DRC and later on in the week in South Sudan?
Well, as you say, faith is very important to people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. About half of the 90 million population are Catholics, and the Pope is here to, I think, first of all, support them in the mission of the Church in this country. He's calling for peace because these countries, both the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan, have been really lacerated by civil wars that are ongoing. The Pope has been very strong on the exploitation that's going on in Africa. So I think it's really both a trip to support the churches in these countries and also to call for peace and to try and bring peace where there's clearly been terrible civil wars in both countries.
Indeed, and we'll get into the intricacies of all of those difficulties for those countries as we continue with our chat. Massimo Fagioli in Pennsylvania. I'm sure theologians across the world, especially Catholic theologians and analysts, will be closely watching the Pope's visit into these countries, and what he has to say will reverberate amongst the Catholic Church.
It will reverberate because Catholicism right now is going through a very delicate process called the synodal process, which is a process of consultation of all Catholics through and thanks to their bishops locally on the major issues that are now at the center of the debate of Catholics, on women in the church, on gender, on LGBT Catholics, and so on. And so some of these questions happen to be divisive within Catholicism, also between the Western world and some African church leaders, and not so many African Catholics. And so this is a less visible issue, especially because of the emphasis given by Pope Francis to the social economic situation of Congo and of Africa. But this is something that I believe is in the background.
Let's bring in Stan Elo in Chicago. This particular Pope has made it his point to highlight the unfairness of the global South, and he's focused on Africa a great deal through his papacy in various addresses to the public. The DRC and South Sudan might well be happy about this, but I suppose Africa generally will be happy to see the Pope there.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can already see from the enthusiasm of the people in Kinshasa how much this visit means to our people, coming as it is in the post-COVID moment. You remember during the COVID that many people predicted that they will be picking dead bodies off the streets of Africa. Many people didn't want this Pope to go. It's too dangerous to go, they say, just like the continuing stigmatization of Africa. So this Pope is breaking this cycle of stigmatization by believing in the continent of Africa. And I think that our people are so happy that the Pope is turning the gaze of the world once more to this continent that has so much potential, but often is either marginalized, stigmatized, or dismissed in world church and in global politics.
Let's go back to Massimo here in Pennsylvania, because this visit was well planned, as most papal visits are. But the recent conflict that we've been hearing about and seeing in the east of the country has certainly changed the tone of what he's been saying. How does this impact on, you might say, the public at large, and also the Catholic diaspora who's watching perhaps to see whether the Pope can make a difference?
I believe the Catholic Church and the papacy and its diplomatic arm has made a difference already in the most recent years in the history of Congo, because let's remember the previous papal visits happened under the dictatorship. And so now there has been a complicated democratic transition, but that is a difference. So the Vatican is always very well informed on what happens on the ground. It has one of the best diplomacies in the world. And so I think that this trip has been modified by what's happening in some areas, but I do not think that this has been a surprise for those who have planned this trip, which are usually very well informed and very good diplomats. And so I don't think this will modify the core message of Pope Francis, which is what we have heard yesterday already during the first Mass.
Christopher Lamb, can I just bring you in here? Because obviously civilians, certainly the public in the DRC and South Sudan, will look for guidance from their spiritual leader as he arrives. But again, spiritual leaders like the Pope always don't really want to, or try not to, interact and interfere in the politics of a region or a country. But this Pope is very vocal about things that, you know, touch a nerve, don't they, with politicians? And he's not been backward in coming forward when it comes to the issues of the DRC.
That's right. And of course, the Pope visits the country both as a head of state and as the leader of the Catholic Church. And so in his role as head of state, he engages with the leaders of the country, and he addressed them yesterday with a very powerful message calling for the end of the exploitation of Africa. And then as the leader of the church, today it's all been about emphasizing the work the church can do for peace, about saying that there can be no justification for violence, Anyone who is calling themselves a Christian, he said, and engaging in violence must lay down their arms. So he has that dual role that he can utilize on a papal visit. Of course, he doesn't have specific policy proposals that he wants to see implemented. He comes as a person of faith, and he comes to try and change the hearts and minds of people. That's the main resources he has at his disposal.
Yeah.
But you could see today there's 1 million people turning out for a mass. That is obviously huge soft power influence, spiritual influence that he seeks to and wants to deploy. And of course, the Catholic Church in the Democratic Republic of Congo has been very involved in trying to ensure free and fair elections, a transition to democracy. And when he goes to South Sudan, we're going to see similar soft power influence when he goes with the Archbishop of Canterbury to try, and the moderator of the Church of Scotland, to try and get the warring leaders to agree to peace. So I think that's how he approaches these things.
Okay, well, let me just bring in Stan Elo there in Chicago, because is this where there is a slight problem, certainly with the Catholic Church, in that the pontiff, as we've just heard, has this dual role. He's the head of the Catholic Church, he's also a head of state, and yet we have his senior bishops and clergy in a country like the DRC who've been very open in being involved in politics, and we put that in inverted commas, overseeing elections, making sure that they are witnesses, pressurising a former president to relinquish in breaking with tradition of the Constitution. That's all history. Does this create a problem within the Catholic Church where the Pope feels uncomfortable with the way his clergy are behaving in, as I say, politics in inverted commas in the DRC?
I don't think so, but you must understand that Pope Francis is for decentralization. He is one of the greatest reforming popes that I will say of our modern time. That is, that local bishops, and not simply the bishop, we're talking about the theology of the people. So he is not a clericalist, someone who just wants to remain at the level of what bishops are doing, what priests are doing. So in Fratelli Tutti, one of his key documents about social transformation, he emphasizes this aspect of creating fraternity. Now, weaving together the broken bonds of society, more so in societies ravaged by wars, violence, exploitation, poverty, and unmitigated human suffering in a country like DRC, that, as we know, is a country that is potentially richer than California, the 10th largest economy in the world. So the Pope is going not to impose, but rather to listen to the cries of the people and to valorize the agency of the people, especially the ordinary folk, people like Sister Angelique Namaika, people who are staying outside in the periphery. They're not always seen.
No.
And so it is about meeting the bishop, then the church leaders. He's also meeting young people.
Can I just interrupt you there? Because I'll talk about the mineral wealth and the people that he's meeting. I want to go back to Massimo Fagoli here, because obviously, as Stan Elo has just said, he wants to try and bring peace to a region that's so traumatised and listen to the people of their woes. But this is a holistic approach, not just the DRC, but also its neighbours. And Rwanda is not involved in this papal visit, yet around about 40% of Rwandans are Catholics, Massimo. Has the Vatican missed a trick by not involving Rwanda as part of their itinerary? Because then that is where the main crux of the problem lies at the moment in the region, isn't it? This relationship between the DRC and Rwanda and the proxies that are fighting in the east of the country.
That is certainly true, and this is something that some members of the clergy and some missionaries in Congo have spoken about openly. When a pope travels and when a pope does his job as pastor of the Universal Catholic Church in a trip abroad, he has to balance two elements, which is on the one side the prophetic message, peace and justice, reconciliation, and speaking truth to power. And on the other side, the other element in balance is diplomacy. So here, what Chris Lamb was saying is very important. The Pope travels as a religious leader, the leader of the Catholic Church, but also as a head of state. And so all these elements are very carefully considered when these speeches are drafted, when they are delivered. The Pope Francis meets what he says and what he doesn't say. One final thing. So it's also important to pay attention to what a Pope doesn't say. And these are silences that are usually picked up by important listeners. And so we shouldn't expect a confrontational line from a Pope who travel in one country against a neighboring country, especially when there are intra-Catholic issues there. But this is certainly something that has not been missed by those who have organized this trip and also by those who are following Pope Francis there.
Sure.
It is prophecy and it's a diplomacy at the same time in a very delicate balance.
It is a delicate balance, isn't it, Christopher? Because obviously, he knows what the problems are. Congo has some of what the world's richest deposits of diamonds, gold, copper, cobalt, tin, tantalum, lithium. International players want those resources. Add to the mix an insurgency, a cross-border, skirmish and fight that's ongoing and has been ongoing for decades. Where does the Pope start in trying to reconcile or try to help reconcile these various disparate groups?
Well, yes, it's obviously a very complicated political situation. What I've been struck by so far in the trip is that the Pope has not held back in identifying the problems and the injustices that he's seeing in the country, which he says are, he doesn't name names, but he does say clearly that there are outside interests who are fueling conflict through greed, through desire to control, and he used the phrase an economic colonialism, which he says is enslaving people. So he is able to speak out very clearly and prophetically, as Massimo said, and he is able to lay out the problems. But as he does have to keep the diplomatic channels open, he's not going to condemn individuals. But it was interesting yesterday, you mentioned Rwanda, the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, in his speech to the Pope, named Rwanda as fueling the conflict in the eastern part of the Congo. And the Pope then responded by saying that actually a forgotten genocide had been going on in the Congo. So there are ways in which to make points without necessarily laying out specific condemnations of individuals.
Stan Hilo, let's just talk about the fact that the Pope and the Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi may have a different take on how to deal with the conflict at the moment in the east. But the Pope is in town. The President Tshisekedi, knows that his words at any podium as he welcomes the Pope will get a lot of airtime globally. How much pressure does that put on, do you think, on groups like the M23 and the government in Kigali, because they're obviously watching very carefully what is happening and what is being said?
I think it's enormous pressure. And just to go back to what Massimo was saying, the Pope has also invited bishops from Rwanda and Burundi, and indeed the Great Lakes area. So he's meeting with these bishops because, as you know, the Catholic Church in Africa indeed is a well-connected, if you like, a well-oiled machinery. So there is an important movement to resolve this problem because, interestingly, both countries have a majority Catholic. Now, I think there's enormous pressure already being brought by the Catholic bishops of Congo, SENCO, the Association of the Episcopal Conference of Congo, on the current president. And so he's already feeling the pressure. And, well, like every other politician, he's trying to use that podium But I think that Pope Francis is focused prophetically on what he thinks and sees as the problem, and that is consistent with his message of a poor and merciful church. And so that the political leaders must take responsibility. The political leaders in Africa, that is, must take responsibility for the wreckages that we see around, because Congo is suffering not simply because of the past, but also because of the present. And the two presidents of Congo and Rwanda must come to the dialogue table. That's what Pope Francis is asking them to practice the African spiritual tradition of Ubuntu, of Palava. And I mean, they have to do this for the sake of our people that are dying every day because of this senseless conflict between two neighborly states and people who have deep historical cultural ties.
I just want to bring in Massimo, because you've been nodding in agreement. I'd just like to hear your take on what Stan has said in Chicago.
Right. I mean, I just wanted to mention that there's a enormous pressure on what's going on in Congo, on Congolese leaders, but as a sideshow, this is happening also in Italy and in Europe, because there has been in these last few days in the coverage of the Pope and of the Vatican in Italy, a series of articles by prominent commentators lamenting that the Pope is devoting too much attention to Africa and to the Southern Hemisphere, and he has forgotten Europe. This is very interesting because this shows how disruptive, in a good sense, Pope Francis is being for the Catholic culture of white men in Europe. And so you see that there are pressures that are very evident there on the ground, but there are other pressures behind the scenes that are mounting against Francis, who seem too attentive to the peripheries of the world. This is a key element of the tensions around this pontificate.
It's funny you should say disruptive, because that feeds into my next question for Christopher Lamb in Kinshasa, because, and I'm quoting here, that the Pope is saying, hands off the Democratic Republic of Congo, hands off Africa, stop choking Africa. It's not a mine to be stripped or a terrain to be plundered. And in terms of the disruptive element of the Pope, he's basically highlighting, isn't he, the rich West, or the developed countries and their companies who use or are using and have used Congo and its resources to build up their own financial wealth, respectively, in their companies and in their countries. And that focus must be very uncomfortable.
Yes, absolutely. And Francis, right from the word go in his pontificate, has had a radical social message. And part of that message is that the Pope wants the Church to go to what he calls the peripheries, and to take the message of the gospel out of, Master was mentioning, what's been the criticism of the Pope in Europe, away from the traditional heartlands of Catholic power, and go out to those countries which are suffering, to speak prophetically and to speak truth to power. And it is striking being here in Kinshasa with the Pope, when you compare the reception the Pope has got and what he's saying and what he's talking about here with some of the things in the Vatican in recent weeks. We've had a series of books from disgruntled former officials lamenting the fact they lost their jobs, they couldn't get certain Vatican apartments. Those things in the Vatican seem like another planet to what's happening in Kinshasa. And you look at the numbers turning out here, you look at the work the Church is doing in healthcare and education, peace building, and actually you think that this is where the Church is both now, today, and it's the Church of the future. I mean, a majority of the population in Congo are under 24. There's a huge number of Catholics. This is the future of Catholicism that we're seeing, and we are witnessing a shift in in the power balance in Catholicism. The Church is in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan.
Stan, I'd like to come to you. We're coming near to the end of the programme, so just some quick questions here. I mean, the Catholic Church, as Christopher mentioned, is becoming more and more relevant to a younger and younger population. The Pope himself thinks that the future of the Catholic Church is in Africa. What's your general impression about the generational divide between young people in the faith and the older generation that have seen maybe 2 or 3 popes?
Yes, I think there's a huge divide. I mean, Africa has also entered the digital world, and the challenge today, I think, is whether Africans can take advantage, that is African Catholics, advantage of this openness that the Pope is showing towards Africa to give Africa a voice. And then for a people that have been held in this old form of Catholicism, there are many African bishops who are very comfortable celebrating Mass in Latin. They want to restore some past, imaginary past glory of Catholicism in Africa. And so even in Congo, there are new churches emerging, Église de Réveil. These are new churches that are strongly opposed to Catholicism, even strongly opposed to the visit of the Pope. Many young people are leaving the traditional Eurocentric tradition, not only of Catholicism, but also the mainline churches, and they're finding home in the Pentecostal and evangelical groups in Africa, and then African indigenous initiatives in Christianity. So I think there is a great divide, and Pope Francis is trying to break this divide by creating the freedom that we didn't have as Africans in the Catholic Church until now, to really speak our own voices and bring African agency to reinventing Catholicism in Africa.
Okay. Stan, thank you very much. Just very quickly, Massimo, final word. What do you hope the legacy of this trip will be?
It's an important trip because it's a glimpse into the future, which is now called global Catholicism or world Christianity, which will look significantly different from what it has been, the Eurocentric, white male-dominated church until a few years ago.
Well, we shall see what does happen and what the legacy of this trip will be in the coming days. To all of my guests, thank you. Christopher Lamb in Kinshasa, Massimo Fagioli in Pennsylvania, and Stan Ilo in Chicago. Thanks for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman, and the whole of the team here, thank you for your time and your company.